They told her to take her little brother and leave before dark. No argument, no shouting. Just her uncle standing in the doorway with bloodshot eyes and whiskey still wet on his shirt, saying the words Ren would carry for the rest of her life. I'm done pretending I can do this. That was it. An old backpack, 2 blankets, half a loaf of bread going stale, and 7-year-old Micah quietly holding the sleeve of her jacket as they walked away from the last door in the world that still knew their names. She didn't cry, she wanted to, but Micah was watching her face the way he always did when he was trying to decide whether to be scared, and Ren understood something most 16-year-olds never have to learn. When you're the only person standing between a child and the dark, you don't get to fall apart. So she kept walking. The October cold had already settled between the pine trees by the time they reached the old logging road. No cars, no lights, just the sound of wet boots against mud and wind moving through branches so high above them the sky had disappeared. Then Micah stopped walking. She turned immediately. His lips were pale. His hands were shaking inside his pockets. Ren, how far are we going? She looked ahead into the endless forest. Truthfully, she had no idea anymore. Far enough, she said quietly. Far enough that nobody sends us away again. They told her to take her little brother and leave before dark. No argument, no shouting, just her uncle standing in the doorway with bloodshot eyes and whiskey still wet on his shirt, saying the words Ren would carry for the rest of her life. I'm done pretending I can do this. That was it, an old backpack, 2 blankets, half a loaf of bread going stale, and 7-year-old Micah quietly holding the sleeve of her jacket as they walked away from the last door in the world that still knew their names. She didn't cry, she wanted to, but Micah was watching her face the way he always did when he was trying to decide whether to be scared, and Ren understood something most 16-year-olds never have to learn. When you're the only person standing between a child and the dark, you don't get to fall apart. So she kept walking. The October cold had already settled between the pine trees by the time they reached the old logging road. No cars, no lights, just the sound of wet boots against mud and wind moving through branches so high above them the sky had disappeared. Then Micah stopped walking. She turned immediately. His lips were pale, his hands were shaking inside his pockets. Ren, how far are we going? She looked ahead into the endless forest. Truthfully, she had no idea anymore. Far enough, she said quietly. Far enough that nobody sends us away again. 8 months earlier, everything had been different. Their father used to make pancakes on Sunday mornings. Not the kind from a box. Real ones measured from memory, the batter slightly too thick because he always said thin pancakes were a sign of someone who didn't care enough. Their mother would sit at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold, reading something on her phone, laughing at whatever their father said even when it wasn't funny. Micah would stand on a stool beside the stove, holding the spatula like a sword, waiting for the moment their father said. Now and then he would flip the pancake with both hands and everybody would cheer even when it landed halfway off the pan. That was February, the last Sunday before the accident. Their parents died on a Tuesday. A logging truck ran a red light on Route 12 outside of Missoula. The police officer who came to the school said it happened quickly, as if speed made death easier to accept. Ren remembered standing in the principal's office holding Micah's hand, listening to a stranger explain that their entire world had ended between one traffic light and the next. After that, there was nobody. No grandparents, no aunts, just Uncle Garrett, their father's younger brother, a man who lived alone in a rented house outside of Kalispell and worked part-time at an auto salvage yard. Garrett had never married, never wanted children, never even kept a dog longer than a season. But the state of Montana gave him custody because his last name was Dawson, and sometimes that's all the system needs. The first month was quiet. Garrett tried. He bought groceries, kept the heat running, and drove Micah to school without complaining. He even asked Ren once if she needed anything for class, and the question was so awkward and sincere that she almost believed things might work. But Garrett was not built to carry other people's weight. By April, the bottles started appearing, not hidden, not apologized for. Just there on the kitchen counter beside the sink on the floor next to the couch where Garrett fell asleep most nights with the television still on. The house began to smell like stale beer and unwashed laundry, dishes piled in the sink until Wren washed them herself. Micah started coming home from school to find the front door unlocked and Garrett gone somewhere he never explained. By summer, Garrett stopped pretending entirely. He stopped buying groceries, stopped driving Micah anywhere, stopped speaking to Wren unless he needed something or she was in his way. The house became a place where three people lived and none of them belonged. Wren took over everything. She walked Micah to school. She cooked whatever she could find in the pantry. She signed his permission slips, washed his clothes, read to him at night from the same book their mother used to read, a battered copy of My Side of the Mountain that smelled like their old house. She was 16 years old and she was already raising a child. Then came the night in October. Garrett had been drinking since noon. Wren could tell by the way his voice changed, not louder but slower, like every word cost him something. She kept Micah in the back bedroom and told him to stay quiet. But 7-year-old boys don't understand quiet the way the world needs them to. Micah came out for water. He walked through the kitchen carefully the way Wren had taught him, staying close to the wall, not looking at Garrett on the couch. But his hand slipped on the glass. Milk spilled across the counter and dripped onto the floor in a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Garrett moved faster than Wren thought a drunk man could. He grabbed Micah's arm and yanked him sideways. The boy's shoulder hit the edge of the counter. Micah cried out, not loudly, more like a sound a small animal makes when it doesn't understand what's happening. Wren was across the kitchen before she knew she was moving. She grabbed Garrett's wrist and twisted it away from her brother. Garrett's other hand came around and caught her across the face, not a punch, an open palm, but hard enough that her vision went white for a moment and she tasted something metallic along her teeth. The kitchen went very still. Garrett stared at his own hand like it belonged to someone else. Then he looked at Wren, looked at the boy cowering behind her, and something in his expression shifted from anger to disgust, but not at himself. At them, at the burden they represented, at the life he never asked for and never wanted. Get out, he said, both of you, get out of my house. Wren didn't argue. She had learned a long time ago that arguing with a man holding a bottle was like arguing with weather. You couldn't change it, you could only survive it. She went to the back bedroom, grabbed the old backpack their father used to take hiking. Stuffed into blankets, a flashlight with weak batteries, the bread from the counter, a water bottle, and the battered copy of My Side of the Mountain. She put Micah's jacket on him, zipped it to his chin, and knelt down until they were eye to eye. We're going on an adventure, she said. Micah's eyes were red. His lower lip was trembling. But he nodded once because he trusted her more than he trusted anything left in the world. They walked out the front door without looking back. Wren knew she should have called the police. She knew it the way you know a road is dangerous before you drive it anyway. But she also knew what would happen next. Officers would arrive, reports would be filed, and within 48 hours the state of Montana would place 2 Dawson children into the foster care system separately. She had seen it happen. The Morrison girl, 3 houses down, had been separated from her little brother 2 years ago when their mother went to jail. The boy ended up in a group home in Billings. The girl went to a family in Great Falls. They saw each other once after that at a supervised visit in a government office that smelled like floor cleaner and old carpet. Then never again. Wren would die before she let that happen to Micah. So instead of dialing 911, she thought about her father. He used to tell stories at night, the way some fathers read from books, except hers made his stories up from memory and family history and places he had been. One story came back to her now with sudden sharpness, a story about his grandmother, Margaret Dawson. Margaret had lived alone in a tiny cottage deep in the pine forest north of a small Montana town called Pine Fall. She moved there after her husband died in the early 1970s, and she stayed for almost 20 years, growing her own food, holding her own water, surviving winters that would have broken most people. Nobody in the family understood why she stayed, but she did. And when she finally died in the late 1980s, nobody went back. The cottage was still out there. At least it had been the last time their father mentioned it. A forgotten place on forgotten land, too deep in the forest for anyone to bother tearing down. Wren didn't have a map, she didn't have a phone, but she remembered her father saying the old logging road past Garrett's place ran north toward Pine Fall, and that the cottage sat somewhere east of the road up a ridge past a creek you could hear but not always see. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing, and right now nothing was the only alternative. They walked for 3 hours before the trouble started. The logging road was unpaved, rotted, and overgrown with weeds that scraped against their legs in the darkness. Moonlight came and went between the clouds, turning the forest into a shifting maze of silver and black. Every sound was amplified: the crack of a branch, the rustle of something moving through underbrush, the distant cry of an animal Wren couldn't identify and didn't want to. Somewhere past the first mile, Micah whispered that he was hungry. Wren stopped, tore the bread in half, and gave him the bigger piece. She ate her portion in 3 bites. It was dry and tasteless, and it settled in her stomach like a stone, but it was fuel, and fuel was what mattered now. She saved the rest of the loaf inside the backpack, already calculating half a loaf, 2 people, 2 days at most, and that was being generous. The road bent north and climbed gradually into thicker forest. The pines grew taller here, their trunks wide enough that 2 people couldn't reach around them. The air smelled of wet bark and cold earth and something older, something that belonged to the mountains and had been there long before roads or people or any of the small human things that disappear without a trace. Micah held her hand the entire time. He didn't complain, didn't ask questions, just walked beside her with his head down, watching his own feet move across the mud. He was being brave the way only children can be brave, not because they understand the danger, but because they trust the person holding their hand. Once a shape moved in the trees to their left, something large enough to snap branches. Wren pulled Micah behind her and stood perfectly still, her heart slamming against her ribs, the flashlight raised in her fist like a weapon. The batteries were almost dead. The beam barely reached the tree line. Whatever it was, it moved away through the brush and vanished, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound, because silence in a forest at night means something is still close enough to be quiet. They kept walking, but bravery doesn't stop the cold. By the time they passed the 3rd-mile marker, the temperature had dropped below freezing. Wren could see her breath in the moonlight. Her fingers ached inside her pockets. And Micah had started stumbling, not tripping over roots or rocks, but stumbling the way a body stumbles when it's beginning to shut down. She pulled him closer, wrapped one of the blankets around his shoulders while they walked. But the blanket was thin, and the wind cut through it like it wasn't there. Then Micah stopped. He didn't say anything. He just stopped moving, and Wren felt the sudden absence of his footsteps behind her, like a sound going missing from a song. She turned around. The boy was standing in the middle of the road, his blanket trailing in the mud, his face empty of everything except exhaustion. "I can't," he whispered. 2 words, and in those 2 words Wren heard the most terrifying thing she had ever heard in her life. Not fear. Surrender. A 7-year-old boy surrendering to the cold. She knelt down in front of him, took his face in her hands. His skin was ice. His eyes were half closed, drifting the way eyes drift when the body starts pulling a person inward, away from the world toward a warmth that isn't real. "Micah, look at me." He blinked slowly. "I need you to climb on my back. Can you do that?" He didn't answer. But when she turned around and crouched, his arms came up and wrapped around her neck, and his weight settled against her spine like something she had been carrying her entire life without knowing it. Wren stood, her knees shook, her back screamed, but she started walking. One step, then another, then another. She talked to him while she walked, not about anything important, not about where they were going or what would happen next. She talked about pancakes, about the way their father used to flip them too high and their mother would pretend to be angry, about the Sunday mornings that existed in a world that felt so far away now it might as well have been another planet. She talked because as long as she was talking, she could feel Micah's breath against her neck. And as long as she could feel his breath, she knew he was still there. The forest grew darker. The road narrowed, trees pressed in from both sides until the branches formed a ceiling above them, blocking what little moonlight remained. Wren couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead. Every step was a guess. Every shadow was a threat. Then she noticed the fence. At first, she thought it was just more forest, more deadfall tangled in the underbrush. But the line was too straight, too deliberate. She stopped and reached out with one hand while holding Micah's weight with the other. Her fingers touched old wood, rough and splitting, but still standing. Fence posts running east into the trees buried beneath weeds and moss, almost swallowed by 40 years of neglect. But still there, still marking something. Wren turned off the road and followed the fence. The ground sloped upward through thick pine. Wet branches slapped at her face. Her boots slipped on moss-covered rocks. Micah's weight pressed harder against her back with every step, and she could feel his grip on her neck weakening, his arms going slack. "Stay with me," she said through her teeth, "just a little farther." Then the trees opened, and there in a small clearing, barely touched by moonlight, stood the cottage. It was smaller than she expected, smaller than her father's stories had made it. One room, maybe two, with a roof that sagged heavily on the left side and walls covered in wild vines that had been climbing for decades. One window was broken, the door was shut, held closed by an old chain looped through the handle and padlocked to a rusted nail in the frame. Nobody had lived here in a very long time, but somebody had once. Wren could see it, beyond the cottage, beneath the tangled weeds and dead grass. The ground was shaped differently, straight rows, careful spacing, the ghost of a garden that someone had once tended with patience and love, now buried under years of silence. She lowered Micah to the ground carefully. He sat against the tree, shivering, his eyes barely open. Wren looked at the chain on the door. Then she picked up a heavy stone from the edge of the clearing and swung it. The old padlock broke on the second hit. The chain fell away with a sound like bones dropping. Wren pushed the door with her shoulder. The wood scraped loudly across the floor as it swung inward, releasing a wave of cold, dusty air that smelled of ashes and decades of emptiness. She carried Micah inside. The cottage was one room. A narrow kitchen corner occupied the back wall with a few bare shelves, a rusted sink, and a counter covered in grime. Near the center of the room stood a small iron stove, black with age, its pipe running upward through the ceiling. A single chair sat beside it, draped with a faded blanket that might have been blue once. Against the far wall, a wooden cot held a thin mattress, stained with watermarks. Everything was covered in dust. The air was so still, it felt like the room had been holding its breath for 40 years, waiting for someone to open the door. Wren laid Micah on the cot and pulled both blankets over him, their blankets on top of the old one. The boy curled into a ball, immediately shivering so hard the cot frame rattled against the floor. She needed fire. Everything else could wait, the questions, the fear, the enormity of what she had just done, but fire could not. Wren knelt beside the iron stove and pulled open its door. The firebox was empty except for a thin layer of ancient ash. She looked around the room, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Moonlight slipped through cracks in the walls, thin silver lines that cut across the floor like scars. Then she saw it. Near the stove, stacked against the wall and protected from the rain by the overhang of the roof, sat a small pile of chopped firewood. Not much, maybe enough for one night, maybe two, but dry, bone dry. Someone had cut this wood and stacked it here before they left, as if they knew that someday someone might need it. Wren grabbed 3 pieces and arranged them inside the stove. She crumpled pages from an old newspaper she found wedged beneath the woodpile, yellow and brittle, and pushed it between the logs. Then she searched for matches. She found them in a tin on the shelf beside the window. An old matchbox, the kind with a striking strip on the side. She opened it. 5 matches left, 5 chances. She struck the first one. It snapped in half. She struck the second. The head flared for a moment, then died. Micah made a sound from the cot, a small lost sound like a child calling out in a dream. Ren looked at him. His face was pale in the darkness. His shivering had become something deeper than shivering, a trembling that seemed to come from the center of his body. If she couldn't light this fire, the night was going to become very dangerous very fast. She struck the third match. The flame caught, held, burned steady between her fingers. Ren cupped it with both hands, lowered it to the crumpled newspaper and watched the paper catch and curl and send the first orange light into the cottage in 40 years. The kindling crackled. The wood began to glow. Heat, fragile and tentative, started pushing back against the cold. Micah lifted his head from the blankets. His eyes reflected the firelight, and for one moment the boy looked like himself again. Not frightened, not freezing, just tired and warm and watching his sister the way he always watched her, as if she could fix anything. Ren fed the fire carefully, adding wood one piece at a time, not too fast, the way her father taught her on camping trips that felt like 1,000 years ago. The iron stove ticked and groaned as it heated, and slowly, degree by degree, the tiny cottage began to warm. She sat on the floor beside the cot and rested her back against the wall. Her muscles ached. Her face still throbbed where Garrett had struck her. Her boots were soaked through and her toes were numb. But the fire was alive and Micah was breathing steadily beneath the blankets, and for this one moment that was enough. Outside, the pine forest stretched endlessly into the Montana night. No lights, no roads, no one who knew where they were. Inside, the forgotten cottage glowed with the first warmth it had felt in decades. Ren didn't sleep that night. She sat beside the stove and kept the fire burning, feeding it the way you feed a fragile thing, with patience and attention and the quiet understanding that if you stop, everything stops with you. Every 30 minutes she checked Micah's breathing, touched his forehead, pulled the blankets tighter around his shoulders. Sometime around 3 in the morning the shivering stopped, his breathing deepened, color began returning to his lips, and Ren finally allowed herself to feel the thing she had been holding back since they walked out of Garrett's front door: terror. Not the sharp kind, not the kind that makes you scream, the slow kind, the kind that settles into your chest like cold water and stays there filling every empty space. She was 16 years old, sitting in an abandoned cottage in the middle of nowhere, responsible for a child she could barely keep warm, with no money, no phone, no food beyond half a loaf of bread, and no one in the world who cared whether they lived or died. For 5 minutes she let herself feel all of it: the weight, the impossibility, the loneliness so deep it felt physical, like someone pressing both hands against her ribs. Then she closed her eyes, breathed, and put it away, because Micah would wake up in a few hours, and when he did, he would look at her face to decide how scared he should be. And if she looked broken, he would break too, so she wouldn't look broken. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever, if she could help it. That was the deal she made with herself in the dark, the deal no one would ever know about. She would carry the fear so he didn't have to. She would be the wall between him and everything that wanted to take him away. It wasn't fair. She knew that. 16-year-old girls shouldn't have to make those kinds of deals. But fairness was a word that belonged to a world that still had parents in it, and Ren didn't live in that world anymore. She lived in this one, the one with the cold and the dark and the stove that needed feeding. So she fed it. Morning came slowly. Gray light crept through the cracks in the walls and through the broken window, turning the cottage from black to silver to the pale brown of old wood. The fire had burned down to embers, but the room was still warm enough that Ren could feel her fingers again. A thin trail of smoke drifted from the stovepipe, barely visible, like a thread connecting the cottage to the sky. The forest outside was different in daylight, less threatening. The pine trees stood tall and straight in every direction, their trunks dark red, beneath patches of morning sun, their branches forming a canopy so dense the ground below was carpeted in brown needles instead of grass. Birds called from somewhere high in the canopy. A woodpecker hammered against a dead tree with a rhythm that sounded almost mechanical, steady, and relentless, like a clock that ran on instinct instead of gears. Micah slept until the light reached his face. Then he opened his eyes, blinked twice, and looked around the cottage with the careful expression of a child who isn't sure if he's still dreaming. He touched the wall beside the cot, ran his finger through the dust on the blanket, looked up at the ceiling where a spider had built a web between two beams, the strands catching the light like silver wire. Where are we? Wren poured water from their bottle into one of the old tin cups she found on the shelf. She handed it to him. "We're at Great-Grandma Margaret's house," she said. "Dad used to tell us about it. Remember?" Micah took the cup and drank. He looked at the walls, the stove, the faded blanket, the dust. He looked at everything the way children look at places that are new and old at the same time, with curiosity that hasn't yet learned to be disappointed. "It's small," he said. Wren almost smiled. "It is. Is anyone else here, just us?" Micah thought about this for a moment. He swung his legs off the cot and placed his bare feet on the wooden floor, then pulled them back immediately because the floor was cold. He put his boots on carefully, the way Wren had taught him, left foot first, double knot, then right. Then he pulled the blanket tighter and asked the question that mattered more than anything else. "Are we staying?" Wren looked around the cottage, at the cracked walls, the sagging roof, the iron stove still clicking as it cooled, at the dust and the spider webs and the 40 years of emptiness that hung in the air like something you could almost touch. Then she looked at her brother, 7 years old, holding a tin cup in both hands, asking the only question he cared about. "Yeah," she said, "we're staying." The first thing Wren did that morning was search the cottage from corner to corner. The kitchen shelves were mostly bare. A few old jars with nothing inside them, a rusted can opener, a set of tin plates and cups filled with dust. Beneath the counter, she found a wooden box containing a ball of twine, a dull knife, and 3 candle stubs melted to the bottom. The main room offered little more. The cot, the chair, a small wooden trunk pushed against the wall, empty except for moth-eaten clothes that crumbled when she touched them. A kerosene lantern hanging from a nail beside the window, dry but intact. But it was the back corner of the kitchen that stopped her. Behind the counter, almost invisible beneath a layer of grime, was a narrow door cut into the floor. Not a trapdoor exactly, more like a hatch with a recessed iron ring for a handle. Wren pulled it open. Cold air rushed upward from below. Micah appeared beside her instantly. "What's down there? I don't know yet. Stay here." She lowered herself through the hatch carefully. The ladder was just 3 wooden rungs nailed into the wall, the bottom one cracked, but holding. Her boots hit packed earth. The air down here was different, heavier, colder. It smelled of damp stone and something mineral like the inside of a well. The cellar was shallow, barely 6 feet deep, with rough stone walls and a dirt floor. Wooden shelves lined both sides, most of them empty now, except for dusty mason jars and a few forgotten potatoes so old they had turned black and soft. Cobwebs stretched between the shelves in thick curtains. Something small skittered away from her feet into the darkness. But at the back of the cellar she heard it, water. Not dripping, not seeping, flowing. A thin stream of clear water emerged from a crack in the stone wall and fell into a shallow basin carved into the rock below. The basin overflowed into a narrow channel that disappeared beneath the foundation. Wren cupped her hands beneath the stream. The water was cold enough to ache. She brought it to her lips and drank, clean, real, constant. She stood there for a moment, water dripping from her fingers, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, something more practical than hope. Recognition, the recognition that this place had what they needed to survive. Then she saw the box. On the lowest shelf, pushed into the darkest corner, sat a metal tin about the size of a shoebox. Wren pulled it out and wiped the dust away. The lid was rusted shut. She worked it open with a dull knife, prying carefully until the seal broke with a soft pop. Inside were papers. Old papers, yellowed and brittle at the edges, but still intact. She lifted them out one by one. A property deed dated 1971, transferring 40 acres of forest land to Margaret and Thomas Dawson. A faded photograph of a woman standing beside the cottage, younger, with dark hair pinned back and an expression that was neither happy nor sad, but something more private than either, the look of a person who had chosen solitude and made peace with it. And beneath the photograph, a letter. The handwriting was small and steady, written in pencil on lined paper torn from a notebook. Wren held it beneath the thin light from the hatch and read, "To whoever finds this place. This land belongs to the Dawson family. It has belonged to us since before the logging companies came before the highway, before anyone in town cared about these trees. I am writing this because I am old now and I don't know if anyone will come back after I'm gone. But if you do come back and if you are a Dawson, know this. Don't let them take it. There are men in Pine Fall who have wanted this land for years. They tried to buy it from Thomas. They tried again after he died. I told them no every time. This is Dawson land. It stays Dawson land. If you're reading this, the land is yours. Take care of it. Take care of the garden. Take care of the spring. And don't trust anyone from town until they give you a reason to. Margaret Dawson, 1986." Wren read the letter twice, then a third time, more slowly, tracing the pencil marks with her fingertip as if she could feel the pressure of Margaret's hand through the paper. The handwriting was steady and unhurried, no crossings out, no hesitation. This was a woman who said what she meant and meant what she said. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the tin with the deed and the photograph, and sat in the cold cellar for a long time, listening to the water flow. The sound was constant, a soft rushing that filled the small stone room the way a heartbeat fills a chest. Always there, always steady, easy to forget until you listened for it. She looked at the photograph again. Margaret stood beside the cottage in what looked like late summer. The garden behind her was full green, alive. Her hands were at her sides, dirt still visible on her fingers. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't unhappy. She looked like a woman who had made a choice and was living with it, not suffering through it, not celebrating it, just living. Wren understood something in that moment, sitting in the cellar beneath the house her great-grandmother had built a life in. She understood that surviving alone wasn't about being strong. It was about deciding every single day to keep going. Margaret had made that decision for 20 years. Wren only had to make it one day at a time. Them. Don't let them take it. She didn't know who Margaret meant. Not yet. But the warning landed somewhere deep inside her, in the place where instinct lives, and settled there like a stone dropping into still water. She climbed back out of the cellar carrying the tin box. Micah was sitting on the floor near the stove, eating the last of the bread, tearing it into small pieces the way he always did, making it last. "What did you find?" "Papers. Old ones. This place belonged to our family." Micah looked at the cottage with new eyes, like us family, like great-grandma, Dad's grandmother. "She lived here a long time ago." The boy considered this. Then he looked at the stove, the shelves, the dust. "She lived here alone for a long time." "Yeah." Micah was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised her. "That's kind of brave." Wren looked at her little brother, 7 years old, holding breadcrumbs in his palm, sitting in a cottage that hadn't seen a living soul in 4 decades. "Yeah," she said, "it really was." She tucked the tin box beneath the cot, hidden under the blankets where no one would see it. Then she went outside. The morning light made everything look different. The cottage was worse than she thought. The roof sagged badly on the left side, and she could see daylight through the gap where boards had rotted away. The walls were solid enough, thick pine logs sealed with old chinking that had cracked in places but still held. The chimney was intact. The porch, if you could call it that, was a single plank of wood resting on 2 flat stones. But the garden... Wren walked past the cottage and stood at the edge of the clearing. The weeds reached her knees, dead and brown from the coming winter. But beneath them, the ground told a different story. Straight rows, even spacing, raised beds outlined by rocks placed with deliberate care. Someone had worked this soil for years, turning it, feeding it, coaxing food from it season after season. Margaret. Wren could almost see her. A woman alone in the forest, kneeling in the dirt each morning, planting seeds, pulling weeds, talking to the earth the way lonely people talk to the things they tend. Growing her own food, surviving on her own terms. The garden hadn't been touched in 40 years, but the bones of it were still there, waiting beneath the weeds like a skeleton waiting to be given flesh again. Micah wandered out beside her. He kicked at the dead grass with his boot and uncovered a row of flat stones lining a garden bed. Someone was really good at this, he said. Wren nodded. Then she looked at the forests surrounding them, the pine trees, the silence, the complete and total absence of anyone who could help them. She thought about the bread almost gone, the water in the cellar reliable but not food, the cold getting worse every day, October in Montana, the nights dropping below freezing, snow coming soon, weeks away, maybe less. If they were going to survive here, she had to start now. She went back inside, found the old axe leaning against the wall beside the door, tested its weight. The handle was dry but solid. The blade was dull but still edged. She could sharpen it on a rock. Micah watched her from the porch. "What are you doing getting ready?" she said. "For what?" "For everything." That first full day set the pattern for every day that followed. Wren worked from the moment sunlight hit the clearing until the darkness pushed her back inside. She chopped fallen branches and dragged them to the cottage, the rough bark scraping against her palms until the skin broke. She split logs with the old axe, learning through failure. The first dozen swings glancing off the wood at wrong angles, sending the axe handle vibrating through her arms until her elbows ached. But she kept swinging. By the end of the first day, she could split a dry pine log in 2 strokes. By the third day, one. Her shoulders burned, her hands blistered and bled, then hardened into calluses that would stay with her for years. The blisters were the worst part, not the pain itself, but the knowledge that there was no one to show them to, no one to tell her to rest, no one to take the axe and say, "I'll finish this, go inside." She was the only one. So she wrapped strips of cloth from the moth-eaten clothes around her palms and kept going. She gathered dry wood from beneath the thickest pines where the rain couldn't reach and stacked it against the cottage wall in rows that grew taller each day. She learned which wood burned hot and which burned long. Pine caught fast but disappeared quickly. The old hardwood from fallen oaks down the ridge burned slower, steadier, and held heat in the iron stove long after the flames died down. She began sorting her wood pile, fast burning on the left for morning fires, slow burning on the right for the long, cold nights. Micah helped, not with the heavy work, he was too small for that, but with everything else. He cleaned the old jars in the kitchen, scrubbing them with sand and water from the spring until the glass was clear again. He gathered pine needles by the armful and stuffed them into the cracks beneath the door and along the baseboards where the cold crept in at night. He sorted through the contents of the kitchen shelves and found things Wren had missed. A small bag of dried beans tucked behind a jar, a spool of wire, a tin of salt that was mostly full. He also talked, constantly. To himself, to the jars he was cleaning, to the stove, to the walls. He gave names to things. The stove was Old Henry. The cot was the ship. The broken window was the lookout. Wren listened to him while she worked outside, his voice drifting through the walls, and every time she heard it, she felt the same thing, a small, fierce gratitude that he was still a child, that the world hadn't taken that from him yet. Small things. But Wren was learning that small things were the difference between surviving and not surviving. A handful of dried beans was a meal. A spool of wire was a snare. A tin of salt was the difference between eating and eating well. Out here, nothing was too small to matter. Out here, small things saved your life. On the second evening, she followed the sound of the spring downhill from the cottage and discovered a narrow creek running between moss-covered rocks. The water was shallow and fast and cold enough to numb her hands in seconds. but she saw movement in the deeper pools, quick silver shadows darting between the stones. Fish. She didn't have a rod, didn't have line or hooks, but she remembered something from the book My Side of the Mountain, the one their mother used to read. The boy in the story made a fish trap from sticks and twine. Wren had twine, she had sticks, she had a dull knife. It took her 2 hours to build something that looked more like a bird's nest than a trap. She placed it in the deepest pool and wedged it between two rocks with the opening facing upstream. Then she went back to the cottage and waited. The next morning she returned to the creek before sunrise. The trap held 2 small trout, each barely longer than her hand, thrashing weakly against the woven sticks. She carried them back to the cottage inside her jacket, their cold bodies pressed against her stomach. Micah was awake, sitting on the cot, wrapped in blankets. His eyes went wide. "You caught fish?" Wren nodded. She was tired. Her hands were raw. Her back ached from a night on the floor. But she held up the 2 trout, and something that might have been pride moved through her, quick and warm, like the first match catching. They cleaned the fish together. Wren showed Micah how to gut them, the way their father once showed her on a camping trip by the Flathead River a lifetime ago. She remembered her father's hands over hers, guiding the knife, his voice calm and patient as he explained where to cut and where to stop. She could almost hear him now, standing behind her in the tiny cottage kitchen, saying, "Good, just like that, you've got it." But when she turned around, there was only the wall. They cooked the trout slowly on top of the iron stove with wild onions Wren had found growing along the edge of Margaret's old garden, their green tops still visible above the dead weeds like small stubborn flags. She added a pinch of the salt they had found and a handful of dried beans soaked since morning. The smell filled the tiny cottage within minutes, rich and warm and deeply achingly human. For the first time since leaving Garrett's house, the cottage smelled like someone lived there, like someone cared enough to cook a meal and sit down and eat it, like home, or at least the memory of one. That night they ate together beside the fire. Micah sat on the floor with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, eating small bites of fish, with his fingers careful and quiet. He ate the way children eat when they have learned not to waste anything, not because someone told them, but because they understood. Halfway through, he stopped eating and looked at her. "This is really good, Wren." 3 words. But they landed somewhere inside her chest and stayed there warm and solid like a small coal that refused to go out. Wren watched him and felt the knot in her chest loosen just slightly. Not disappear, just loosen. Enough that she could breathe without thinking about breathing. Outside, the wind moved through the endless pines. Inside, the darkness had edges now pushed back by firelight and the faint smell of cooked food and the presence of 2 people who were learning slowly to stay alive. On the morning of their 5th day in the cottage, Wren stepped outside carrying the axe and stopped. The air was cold and still. Frost coated the dead grass in a thin white layer that crunched under her boots. Her breath hung in front of her face. The forest was quiet in the way forests are quiet in early morning, not empty but waiting, listening. She was halfway to the wood pile when she looked down. There, in the soft mud near the porch, pressed clearly into the earth, were footprints. Not hers, not Micah's, too large, too heavy, made by a boot with deep treads, the kind worn by someone who spent time in the woods. A man's boot size 11 or 12 pressed deep enough into the mud to tell her the person was heavy or was standing in one place for a long time, or both. The prints came from the east, following the tree line. They moved carefully, deliberately, staying close to the edge of the clearing where the shadows were deepest. They approached the cottage in a wide arc, avoiding the open ground. They stopped beneath the broken window, the one that faced the cot, where Micah slept. And there, beneath the window, the mud was pressed down in a way that made Wren's stomach drop. Not a single footprint. A patch, flattened, worn, the mark of someone who had stood there for minutes, not seconds. Someone who had positioned themselves in the dark and looked through the broken glass at a sleeping child. Then the prince turned and walked back into the forest the way they came. Someone had stood outside the cottage in the dark. Someone had watched them through the window while they slept. Wren crouched beside the prince and touched the edge of one with her fingertip. The mud was still soft, fresh, made some time during the night while the fire was low, while she was sleeping on the floor with her back against the wall and her brother breathing softly 3 feet away. She felt something cold move through her body that had nothing to do with the temperature. It started in her stomach and climbed upward through her chest until it reached her throat, and she had to swallow twice to push it back down. She looked into the forest. The pine trees stood in their endless rows, dark and silent and revealing nothing. Whatever had been here was gone now, but it had been here, and it knew they were here too. Wren stood slowly. She looked at the cottage, the thin walls, the broken window, the door that locked with nothing but a piece of wire. She said nothing to Micah. When he came outside and asked why she was staring at the ground, she told him she was looking for animal tracks to figure out where the rabbits fed. He believed her because he was 7 and because he trusted her. But that night, Wren propped the axe beside the door within arm's reach. She fed the fire until it blazed the orange light, pushing shadows into the corners, making the cottage feel smaller and safer, a room of warmth inside an ocean of cold. She checked the wire on the door twice, moved the cot away from the broken window and positioned it against the far wall where no one could see in from outside. Micah noticed. "Why are we moving the bed?" Wren kept her voice even. "The draft is worse near the window. Will be warmer over here." He accepted this because he was 7 and because he trusted her the way a child trusts the ground beneath their feet completely, without question, without the knowledge that ground can shift. And she didn't sleep. Instead, she sat in the dark beside the window and watched the tree line until morning came. The fire crackled behind her. Micah's breathing rose and fell in the quiet rhythm of deep sleep. Outside, the forest stood massive and patient and full of things she couldn't see. She thought about Margaret's letter, about the warning written 40 years ago by a woman who lived alone in these woods and trusted no one, a woman who had protected this land by herself year after year until she couldn't anymore. Don't let them take it. Wren didn't know who was out there. She didn't know what they wanted. But she understood one thing with perfect clarity, the kind of clarity that comes not from thinking but from somewhere deeper, somewhere in the blood, in the bones, in the part of a person that knows danger before the mind catches up. This cottage was theirs now. This land was theirs. And she would protect it the way Margaret had protected it, the way her father should have been alive to protect it, the way no one had protected her and Micah when they needed it most. She would not be taken from this place. She would not let anyone take her brother from this place. She would fight for it with everything she had, even if everything she had was an old axe, a rusted stove, and the stubborn refusal to be thrown away one more time. The world had already taken her parents. It had given her an uncle who couldn't love her, and a system that would separate her from the only family she had left. It had pushed her into the woods with nothing and expected her to disappear. But Wren Dawson was still here, and she wasn't going anywhere. The forest watched, the cottage held, and somewhere out in the darkness beyond the reach of firelight, the footprints waited to become a name. The journal changed everything. Wren found it on the 9th morning while repairing a crack in the kitchen wall where the wind had been seeping through at night. She had been packing the gap with a mixture of mud and pine resin, pressing it into the space between the logs with her fingers when the chinking on the interior side crumbled away and a section of the wall opened into a narrow cavity between the inner and outer logs. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth so old it had gone stiff and dark, was a notebook. Not a letter, not a scrap of paper. A full notebook, the kind with a marbled cardboard cover and lined pages stitched into the spine, the kind that school teachers used to buy at general stores 50 years ago. The oilcloth had done its job. The pages were yellowed but dry, the handwriting still legible, small and steady and slanting slightly to the right, Margaret Dawson's handwriting, the same hand that wrote the letter in the cellar. But this was different. This was not a warning left for strangers. This was a life. Ren sat on the floor beside the stove and opened the notebook to the first page. The date read April 3rd, 1972. The entry was short. Thomas has been gone 4 months now. The snow is finally melting. I planted the first piece today along the south fence where the sun hits longest. The soil is still cold, but I cannot wait any longer. If I wait for the world to be ready, I will never do anything at all. Ren turned the pages slowly. Margaret wrote about the garden, the weather, the animals that came to the clearing. She wrote about the spring in the cellar, how she had discovered it by accident when the floor gave way during her first winter alone. She wrote about the pine trees and the way they sounded in the wind at night like an ocean she could hear but never see. But she also wrote about practical things. How to set a snare for rabbits using wire and a bent sapling. How to dry venison in thin strips hung above the stove. How to identify yarrow and chamomile and elderberry growing wild along the creek. How to make a poultice for cuts that wouldn't stop bleeding. How to read the sky for storms because weather in Montana didn't warn you twice. It was a survival manual disguised as a diary, a woman teaching the future how to stay alive. Ren read for 2 hours, then she closed the notebook, pressed it against her chest, and sat there in the quiet cottage, feeling something she hadn't felt since her father died. Connection, not to a living person, to a dead woman who had sat in the same room beside the same stove and faced the same question Ren was facing now. How do you keep going when there is no one left to help you? And Margaret's answer, written across 100 pages in steady pencil, was simple. You just do, one day at a time, one task at a time, one seed in the ground at a time. Micah was outside sorting pine cones he had collected into rows by size. He did this every morning, arranging things, organizing the small pieces of his world into patterns he could control. Ren watched him through the window and made a decision. She would follow Margaret's instructions, every one of them. She would learn what this woman had learned, do what this woman had done, and she would keep her brother alive through the winter, even if the effort killed her. She started that afternoon. The next 2 weeks became the hardest of Ren's life. Following Margaret's journal entries from October and November, she began preparing for winter with a focus that bordered on obsession. She built snares from the wire Micah had found, setting them along the rabbit trails Margaret described near the eastern tree line. The first 3 days the snares caught nothing. On the fourth morning she found a cottontail stiff and cold, its neck caught in the loop. She carried it back to the cottage and cleaned it the way Margaret described, cutting quickly, wasting nothing, setting the pelt aside to dry. Micah watched with wide eyes but didn't look away. He was learning too. Not the way children learn in school from books and repetition, but the way humans learned for 10,000 years before schools existed. By watching, by doing, by understanding that the animal in his sister's hands was the difference between eating tonight and not eating. They roasted the rabbit over the stove with dried beans and the last of the wild onions. It was the best meal they'd had since arriving. Ren also found the orchard. She discovered it on the 11th day while following an old path downhill from the cottage that Margaret's journal mentioned, but the forest had nearly erased. The entry had been simple. The apple orchard is a quarter-mile south-southeast down the deer trail past a split boulder. Thomas planted the first trees the year we married. I have added to them every year since. Ren found the split boulder, found the deer trail, now just a faint parting in the undergrowth. She followed it through dense pine for 10 minutes, pushing through branches that hadn't been disturbed in decades, climbing over a fallen tree so large she had to scramble on her belly across the moss-covered trunk. Then suddenly the trees opened into a wide clearing on a south-facing slope and Ren stopped walking. Apple trees, dozens of them, maybe 40 or 50. It was hard to count because their branches had grown into each other, tangling overhead like hands reaching across a table to hold on to something. They stood in crooked rows across the hillside, their trunks thick and gnarled, their bark cracked with age. Thomas Dawson had planted the first ones more than 50 years ago, and Margaret had added more year after year, turning the hillside into an orchard that must have been beautiful once. Even now, wild and overgrown and half forgotten, there was something magnificent about it, the scale of it, the patience it represented, 50 years of someone planting trees they would never see fully grown. Most of the fruit had already fallen and rotted in the grass, soft brown shapes slowly being absorbed back into the earth, feeding the roots that grew them. But not all of it. High on the branches where the deer couldn't reach, small red apples still clung to the wood, tough and sour from the cold but real, edible, alive. Wren climbed 3 trees that afternoon, filling her jacket until the weight pulled at her shoulders. The bark scraped her hands, her arms shook from gripping branches, but each apple she picked felt like money in a bank, like time being added to a clock that was always running down. Near the far edge of the orchard, she found something even better. A massive black walnut tree, its trunk wider than she could reach around the ground beneath it, littered with nuts hidden under fallen leaves. She filled her pockets, filled her backpack, carried as much as she could, haul uphill in 2 trips, her legs burning, her breath coming in sharp white clouds. When she returned to the cottage, Micah looked at the pile of apples and walnuts on the kitchen counter and his face changed. Not a smile exactly, something deeper than a smile. The expression of a child who realizes without being told that maybe they aren't going to die after all. That evening they roasted apples beside the stove while walnuts dried near the firewood stack. The cottage smelled of wood smoke and warm fruit and something that might have been called happiness if either of them had been brave enough to name it. Wren didn't name it. She had learned not to trust. Good days. Good days were just the space between problems, and problems always came back. But she let herself sit beside the fire that night and eat a warm apple with her brother, and she didn't think about footprints or warnings or the vast, indifferent forest outside. For one evening, that was enough. The man appeared on the 16th day. Wren was splitting wood near the porch when the sound reached her. Not an animal sound, not the careless crashing of a deer or the skittering of squirrels through dry leaves. Footsteps. Deliberate ones made by someone who wanted to be heard. The kind of footsteps that announce a person before they arrive, the way a knock announces itself before a door opens. Wren set the axe head on the chopping block and straightened slowly. Her heart was already beating faster. She picked up the axe and stepped in front of the cottage door, positioning herself between whatever was coming and the place where Micah sat inside reading the survival entries she had copied for him from Margaret's journal. A man emerged from the tree line on the east side of the clearing, tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 50 years old, with a weathered face, tanned dark from years outdoors, and gray-streaked hair cut close to his head. He wore a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, heavy boots caked with mud that looked fresh, and carried a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. He walked with the easy, unhurried stride of someone who knew these woods, or at least wanted you to believe he did. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and raised one hand palm open. The gesture was practiced, universal, the kind of gesture people make when they want you to see that they're not holding a weapon, which only matters if a weapon was something you were already thinking about. Easy, he said. I'm not here to cause trouble. Wren didn't lower the axe. Who are you? The man smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that showed teeth without reaching the eyes. Name's Ray Colton. I'm with the County Forestry Service. I patrol this section of the ridge. He reached into his jacket slowly and produced a laminated card. Wren couldn't read it from where she stood, and she didn't step closer. What do you want? Ray lowered the card and looked past her at the cottage, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the firewood stacked neatly against the wall, at the garden rows that had been cleared of weeds. Well, he said, I've been seeing smoke from this ridge for about 2 weeks now. Old Margaret Dawson's place has been empty a long time. I figured I should come check it out, make sure nobody was in trouble up here. He paused, looked at the axe in Wren's hands, looked at her face. "You're a kid," he said. There was surprise in his voice, but Ren noticed they arrived a half second too late, like a man remembering to be surprised. "I'm 16, she said. "Right. And that little one I saw through the trees," your brother. Ren's grip on the axe tightened. "Where did you see him?" Ray shifted the bag on his shoulder. "Relax, sweetheart. I'm just doing my job. Listen, I brought some things. Figured whoever was up here could use a hand." He unzipped the canvas bag and pulled out 2 cans of beef stew, a box of crackers, a small jar of peanut butter, and a bag of dried jerky. He set them on the ground between them like an offering. "Consider it a welcome to the neighborhood gift," he said. Then he smiled again. Micah appeared in the doorway behind Ren. His eyes went straight to the food on the ground, then up to the man standing at the edge of the clearing. The boy's face opened the way children's faces open when they see an adult who seems kind, all the guards dropping at once, all the hunger visible. "Is that for us?" Micah asked. Ray crouched down to the boy's level. "It sure is, buddy. What's your name, Micah?" the boy said before Ren could stop him. "That's a good name," Ray said. He looked up at Ren. "You two out here alone?" Ren held his gaze. "We're fine. I'm sure you are. But winter's coming hard this year. They're calling for heavy snow by late November. 2 kids alone in a 40-year-old cabin. That's not exactly ideal." "We're fine," Ren said again. Ray stood slowly. He looked at the cottage one more time, his eyes moving across it the way a person looks at something they're measuring. Not admiring, calculating. "Well," he said, "you know where to find me. I come through this ridge every week or so. If you need anything, just holler." He turned and walked back into the trees the way he came. Ren watched him until he disappeared completely. Then she watched the tree line for another 10 minutes, standing perfectly still, the axe in her hands, listening to the forest settle back into silence. Micah was already inside, opening the peanut butter. "He's nice," the boy said. Ren said nothing. She was thinking about the way Ray looked at the cottage, the way his eyes moved to the cleared garden, the way he asked about the boy's name before he asked about anything else. And she was thinking about the footprints, the ones from the 5th morning, size 11 or 12, heavy treads, the kind of boot a man who worked in the woods would wear. She looked down at the ground where Ray had been standing. The mud was soft from yesterday's rain. His boot print was pressed clearly into the earth, deep treads, heavy heel, the right foot turning slightly outward. It was the same print. Ren carried the food inside and put it on the shelf without saying a word. She waited 3 days. Then she followed him. Ray came back on a Thursday, same time, same direction, same canvas bag. This time he brought a blanket and a box of matches. He talked to Micah while Ren stood nearby holding the axe she no longer pretended wasn't a weapon. Ray asked questions, casual ones scattered between jokes and compliments, the way a person hides pills in food for a dog. How long had they been here? Did anyone else know they were out here? Had they found anything interesting in the old place? Any papers, any old documents, anything like that? Ren gave short answers. Yes, no, nothing special. She watched Ray's face while he talked, watched the way his eyes moved when he thought she wasn't looking. They didn't stay on her or on Micah. They drifted to the cottage, to the cleared garden, to the cellar hatch visible through the open door. He was cataloging, filing, building an inventory of what was here and what might be hidden. Ray left after 20 minutes. He walked east into the trees the way he always did, following a path that seemed to exist only for him. Ren waited until Micah was inside, told him she was going to check the snares, and then she followed. She stayed far behind, moving from tree to tree, stepping where the pine needles were thickest to muffle her boots. The forest was dense enough that she could keep Ray in sight without exposing herself. A flash of his canvas jacket between the trunks every few seconds, steady and unhurried. He never looked back, never paused. He moved like a man who had walked this route many times and no longer thought about where his feet went. The forest thinned near the bottom of the ridge. The trees gave way to a gravel road Wren had never seen before, wider than the old logging road maintained with fresh tire tracks in the mud and gravel that had been laid down recently. Ray's truck was parked on the shoulder, a white Ford F250, new enough that it still had temporary dealer plates in the window. The cab was clean, the bed was empty, not the truck of a county forestry worker making government wages, the truck of a man with money, or a man who wanted people to think he had money, which in Wren's experience amounted to the same thing. But it was the building across the road that made Wren stop breathing. A prefabricated office trailer sat on a cleared lot surrounded by orange survey stakes, driven into the ground in a grid pattern. A large sign was bolted to the front of the trailer. Wren read it from behind a pine tree, her heart hammering in her chest. Colton Ridge Development Group, Luxury Mountain Resort, Phase 1 coming soon. Below the sign, a site map was mounted behind plexiglass. Wren could see it from 50 yards away. The map showed the entire ridge from the gravel road to the top of the hill. Roads, buildings, a lodge, cabins, parking areas, and in the center of the map, right where the cottage stood, right where Margaret's garden grew, right where Micah was sitting alone right now eating peanut butter from a jar, was a rectangle labeled Main Lodge Site. Wren stood behind the tree and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Ray Colton wasn't a forestry worker. He wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't kind. He was a land developer who wanted 40 acres of Dawson Forest, and the cottage was standing in the way of a project worth more money than Wren would see in her lifetime. The food, the blankets, the friendly questions, all of it was designed to do one thing: find out if anyone had a legal claim to the land, find out if these two children were really alone, find out how easy it would be to make them disappear. She thought of Margaret's letter. Don't let them take it. Now she knew who them was. Wren backed away from the road, silently turned, and ran uphill through the forest faster than she had ever run in her life. She told no one, not Micah, not anyone, because there was no one else to tell. The loneliness of that fact hit her like cold water. In the old world, the world before the accident, she would have told her father. He would have known what to do. He would have made phone calls, hired a lawyer, driven up to Ray Colton's trailer, and told him in plain words to stay away from his family's land. But her father was dead, and the world doesn't give you a replacement for the people it takes. You just learn to do their jobs yourself. Instead, she prepared. That night after Micah fell asleep, Wren took the tin box from under the cot and spread the documents across the floor beside the stove. The property deed, Margaret's letter, the photograph. She read the deed 3 times, memorizing the legal description, the parcel number, the boundaries described in chains and degrees that she didn't fully understand but knew were important. Then she hid everything. Not in the cellar where she'd found it. That was too obvious. Instead, she wrapped the documents in the oilcloth from the journal, sealed it with pine resin, and buried it beneath a flat stone at the base of the walnut tree in the orchard 60 paces southwest of the cottage. A place no one would think to look, a place she could find again even in the dark. She kept Margaret's journal. She needed it. The survival instructions were too valuable to bury. But she hid it inside the mattress of the cot, cutting a slit in the fabric and sliding the notebook between the layers of old cotton batting. Then she went to work on the cottage. Over the next 5 days, Wren transformed the place. She repaired the broken window using a piece of flat wood from the collapsed shed downhill, cutting it to size with the axe and nailing it into the frame with old nails she had straightened on a rock. She patched every crack in the walls. She reinforced the door with a crossbar made from a thick pine branch. Dropping it into iron brackets she bent from scrap metal found in the shed. She built a rain barrel from an old metal drum she dragged uphill from near the orchard, positioning it beneath the corner of the roof where water ran off during storms. She stacked firewood until the pile reached the eaves on both sides of the cottage, enough to burn for weeks. She dug a root cellar extension beside the existing hatch, lining it with stones from the creek, and filled it with apples, walnuts, and dried rabbit meat stored in clean jars. Micah helped without asking why. He sensed the change in her. Not fear exactly, but urgency. A new sharpness in the way she moved, the way she checked the tree line every few minutes, the way she no longer sat with her back to the door. One evening, while they were eating roasted walnuts beside the fire, Micah looked at her and said something that broke her heart in a quiet way. "You look like Dad did before." Before what? Before he started worrying about things he wouldn't tell us about. Ren looked at her brother, 7 years old, seeing things a 7-year-old shouldn't have to see. "I'm not worried," she said. "I'm just being careful." Micah cracked a walnut with a rock and picked out the meat with his fingers. "Is it because of Ray?" Ren's hand stopped moving. "What about Ray?" Micah shrugged. "I don't know. He smiles too much. Dad always said people who smile too much are usually selling something." For a long moment, Ren said nothing. Then she reached across and put her hand on his head the way their father used to do. "Dad was right," she said quietly. That night, she added another crossbar to the door. Ray came back one more time before the storm. This time he didn't bring food, he brought questions. He asked about the cottage's history, about whether Wren had found any old papers or documents inside, about who owned the land and whether anyone in her family had ever filed a claim with the county. Wren stood on the porch with the axe resting against her leg and answered every question with the same 3 words: "I don't know." Ray's smile dimmed with each answer. By the end, he wasn't smiling at all. He stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cottage with an expression Wren recognized because she had seen it on Garrett's face the night he threw them out. Frustration turning into calculation, the look of a man deciding how much force to use. "Well," he said finally, "I hate to be the one to say this, but I've got an obligation. 2 minors living alone out here without a guardian, without school, without medical care. That's not something the county can ignore." Wren felt ice move through her veins. "You're going to report us?" Ray put his hands in his pockets. "I don't want to, sweetheart. Believe me. But I'd be negligent if I didn't. Child Protective Services has to know about this. It's the law." He said it with sadness in his voice. Practiced sadness, the same way his surprise had been practiced that first day. A half-second too late, a performance designed for an audience of one. Wren watched him walk back into the forest. She watched until the tree swallowed him completely. Then she stood on the porch for a long time, the axe at her side, staring at the place where he had disappeared. The forest was silent. The sky was gray. Somewhere far away, a bird called once and then went quiet, as if it too understood that something had changed. He was going to call CPS. He was going to bring people up here who would take Micah away and put them both in the system. 2 children separated, assigned to strangers in different towns, different counties, maybe different ends of the state. She would become a file number. Micah would become a file number. And the cottage would be empty and the land would be unclaimed, and Ray Colton would build his resort on top of Margaret Dawson's garden, on top of the spring, on top of 40 years of a woman's life, and no one would ever know the difference. Nobody would know that a woman named Margaret Dawson had survived here alone for 20 years. Nobody would know that she planted apple trees with her own hands and wrote a journal full of wisdom and buried her husband's deed in a cellar to protect it. Nobody would know that 2 children had come here with nothing and built a life from the ruins. All of it would disappear beneath concrete and luxury cabins and the parking lot where the walnut tree stood. Unless Wren stopped him. She didn't know how. She was 16 years old with an axe and a buried deed and a brother who trusted her to fix everything. She had no phone, no lawyer, no adults on her side. She had Margaret's journal and Margaret's land and Margaret's stubborn refusal to let go. For now, that would have to be enough. The storm arrived 6 days later. It came the way Montana storms always come, without politeness and without apology. Wren felt it before she saw it. The barometric pressure dropped so fast her ears popped while she was splitting wood. The birds went silent, all of them at once, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the forest. The air changed temperature between one breath and the next, warm enough for work and then suddenly cold enough to see her breath. She looked west. The sky above the mountains had turned a color she had never seen before, not gray, not black, but a bruised purple green that looked like something alive and angry moving toward them at the speed of wind. She had read Margaret's journal entries about storms, the ones from December 1977 and January 1981. Margaret described them in the same measured handwriting she used for everything, but certain words appeared that she didn't use anywhere else. Brutal, relentless, the kind that kills. Wren dropped the axe and moved fast. She hauled 3 extra armloads of firewood inside and stacked them against the wall. She filled every jar and cup and pot with water from the spring. She sealed the broken window gap with extra rags and pine resin. She checked the roof, the chimney, the door brackets. The sky turned dark at 11 in the morning. Not dusk dark, storm dark. The kind of darkness that makes noon feel like midnight and tells every living thing in the forest to hide or die. Then the snow began. Not gentle snow, not the kind that drifts down slowly and settles on your shoulders like something made of lace. This was horizontal snow driven by wind so strong Wren could barely stand upright on the porch. The clearing around the cottage disappeared in minutes, swallowed by a wall of white that erased the trees, the fence, the garden, everything. Within an hour, the world beyond the cottage walls simply ceased to exist, replaced by a roaring white void that sounded like a freight train running through the tops of the pines. Wren had prepared for cold. She had not prepared for this. She pulled Micah inside, barred the door, and fed the stove until the firebox glowed orange. The cottage shook with every gust. Snow forced itself through every crack she had missed, thin white lines appearing on the floor like chalk marks drawn by invisible hands. The temperature inside dropped steadily, despite the fire, the cold pressing in from every direction, patient and relentless. By nightfall, the world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the cottage, the fire, and the sound of wind that never stopped. They ate canned stew from Ray's supplies, the irony of which was not lost on Wren. The man trying to destroy their home had also given them the food, keeping them alive. She heated the stew on the stovetop and divided it evenly, watching Micah eat with the focused attention she gave to everything now. He was quieter than usual. The storm frightened him. Not the noise, he could handle noise, but the feeling of the cottage moving. The walls flexed with each gust. The roof beams creaked overhead. Once a loud crack echoed from outside, a tree branch snapping somewhere close, and Micah flinched so hard he dropped his cup. Wren picked it up without a word and handed it back to him. "This house has been standing for 50 years, she said. It's not going to fall down tonight." She didn't know if that was true, but she said it like she knew because that was her job now. To sound certain when nothing was certain. To be the wall. The storm raged through the night and into the next day. And somewhere in the second night, while the wind screamed through the pine trees and the fire fought to stay alive in the stove, Micah began to shiver. Not the normal shivering of a cold child, a different kind, deep and rhythmic and involuntary, coming from somewhere inside his body that blankets couldn't reach. Wren touched his forehead. The heat that met her palm sent a bolt of panic straight through her chest. He was burning. "Micah, look at me. Look at me right now." The boy's eyes opened. They were glassy, unfocused, drifting. He looked at her face but didn't seem to see her. His lips were dry, his breathing was fast and shallow, the breaths of a small body fighting something it couldn't understand. Wren pulled every blanket in the cottage around him. She fed the fire until sparks flew from the stovepipe. She melted snow in a tin cup and held it to his lips, but he could barely swallow. Water dribbled down his chin and soaked into the pillow. She sat beside the cot and pressed her hand against his burning forehead and felt the world narrow to the size of this room, this bed, this child. The storm was outside. CPS was coming. Ray Colton was planning his resort. The entire machinery of the adult world was grinding toward them, slow and indifferent and unstoppable. But none of it mattered now. None of it existed. The only thing that existed was Micah's fever and the question it asked, "What are you going to do?" Ren looked at the door, the crossbar held fast against the wind. Beyond it, the storm raged across the mountainside, burying roads, collapsing branches, turning the forest into an impassable maze of snow and fallen timber. Even if she wanted to leave, even if she was willing to walk into Pinefall and hand herself over to CPS and lose her brother to the system forever, she couldn't. The road was gone, the mountain was sealed, she was trapped, alone, with a sick child and no medicine. Then she thought of Margaret. Ren pulled the journal from inside the mattress with shaking hands. She flipped through the pages, frantically searching for the entries she had read days ago and filed away because they seemed interesting but not urgent. November 18, 1974, fever came on fast after 2 days of cold rain, could not get to town. Made yarrow tea from the dried supply in the tin above the stove. 2 cups hot every 4 hours brought the fever down by morning. Yarrow works better than anything the doctor ever gave me. Ren looked up. Above the stove on the narrow shelf she had cleaned but never examined closely sat a row of small tins. She stood and reached for them. The labels were handwritten in Margaret's careful script. Chamomile, elderberry, yarrow. She opened the yarrow tin. Inside, dried flower heads and leaves, crumbled and faded but still pungent when she crushed them between her fingers. 40 years old. She had no idea if dried yarrow lasted 40 years. She had no idea if it would work. She had no idea about anything except that her brother was burning alive 3 feet away and the storm had taken every other option from her. She boiled water from the spring, steeped the yarrow in a tin cup until the liquid turned dark gold, let it cool enough to drink. Then she lifted Micah's head and held the cup to his lips. "Drink," she whispered. "Please, Micah, drink." The boy's throat moved. He swallowed once, twice, then turned his head away. Ren soaked a cloth in cold water from the spring and pressed it against his forehead. She changed the cloth every 10 minutes, re-wetting it, pressing it back, keeping the rhythm the way you keep a rhythm when the alternative is chaos. She made another cup of yarrow tea 2 hours later and got him to take 3 swallows, then 3 more. She talked to him while she worked. She told him about the garden, about Margaret, about the apple trees on the hillside and the walnut tree and the spring that never stopped flowing. She told him about the life they were going to build here, the 2 of them, the garden they would plant in the spring, the fish they would catch in the creek, the porch she would build where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun go down behind the mountains. She talked because as long as she was talking, she wasn't screaming. And as long as she wasn't screaming, she could keep going. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning, then 2. Ren changed the cloth, made more tea, fed the fire, changed the cloth again. Her eyes burned from exhaustion. Her hands trembled. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop because if she stopped, if she closed her eyes for even a moment, she might open them and find that the breathing had stopped too. Sometime around 3 in the morning, something changed. The shivering slowed. Micah's breathing deepened. The burning heat beneath her palm cooled by 1 degree, then 2, then 3, settling toward something that felt less like fire and more like warmth. His eyelids fluttered. His lips moved. "Ren," he whispered, "I'm thirsty." She poured water and held the cup with hands that shook so badly the water rippled. He drank. Slowly, steadily. Then his eyes closed again, but this time they closed the way a sleeping child's eyes close softly, peacefully, without the terrible inward drift of fever. Ren sat on the floor beside the cot and pressed her forehead against the edge of the mattress and cried. Not loudly, not the kind of crying that makes noise and demands attention. The quiet kind, the kind that comes when you've been holding something so tightly for so long that when you finally let go, your whole body empties. She cried for her parents, for the Sunday mornings that would never come back, for the pancakes and the laughter and the way her mother's coffee used to go cold because she was too busy being happy to drink it. She cried for the home she lost, the real one, the one with the yellow kitchen and the stool by the stove and the sound of her father's voice saying now. She cried for Gareth, not because she missed him, but because she understood him. He was a broken man who couldn't carry what the world put on his shoulders, and instead of asking for help, he drank until the weight didn't matter and then threw it on two children who had nowhere else to go. She didn't forgive him, she might never forgive him, but she understood that damage passes from person to person like water flowing downhill, and sometimes the person at the bottom of the hill is 7-year-old boy who just wanted a glass of milk. She cried for herself, for every night she spent pretending to be strong enough to carry a weight no 16-year-old should ever have to carry, for every time she smiled at Micah when she wanted to scream, for every question she answered with certainty when the truth was she had no idea what she was doing, for the deal she made with herself in the dark on their first night in the cottage, the deal to carry the fear so he didn't have to, and the price that deal was costing her paid in sleepless nights and aching muscles and a loneliness so deep it had become part of her body. She cried for Margaret too, for a woman she had never met who had lived alone in this room for 20 years, writing in a journal that no one would read, planting trees that no one would harvest, protecting land that no one would thank her for keeping. A woman who died alone in this forest and left behind nothing but a cottage and a warning and the ghost of a garden. She cried for 5 minutes, maybe 6. She let every held breath, every swallowed scream, every suppressed sob come out of her body like poison being drawn from a wound. And when it was done, when the last shudder passed through her chest and the tears dried on her cheeks, she felt something she hadn't expected. Lighter, not healed, not happy, but lighter. As if the crying had removed something heavy that had been sitting on her lungs since February, and now there was room to breathe again. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, checked Micah's breathing one more time, and fed the stove. The fire held. The boy slept. The storm raged on. By morning, the fever had broken completely. Micah woke up pale and weak but clear-eyed. He asked for water, then food, then told Wren that old Henry the stove had kept him warm all night and deserved an extra log as a thank you. Wren gave old Henry 2 extra logs and didn't bother explaining that stoves didn't have feelings because right now kindness toward inanimate objects felt like the sanest thing in the world. The storm continued through the day, weaker now, the wind dropping to gusts that shook the trees but no longer bent them double. Snow still fell but gently, almost lazily, as if the storm had exhausted itself and was drifting off to sleep. By late afternoon, patches of pale blue sky appeared between the clouds, and the light that came through was thin and golden and looked like forgiveness. Wren stepped outside for the first time in 2 days. The world was white. The logging road had vanished beneath 3 feet of snow. The garden was a smooth white field, unmarked, as if nothing had ever grown there. The fence posts were buried to their tops. Even the woodpile, tall as it was, wore a thick cap of snow that made it look like a row of white-haired old men standing shoulder to shoulder. The silence was extraordinary. After 2 days of constant wind, the absence of sound was almost physical, a pressure against the eardrums, the world holding its breath. Nothing moved, no birds, no wind, no branches creaking. Just the vast clean stillness of a landscape that had been scoured and remade. Wren walked to the edge of the clearing. Her boots sank to the knee with each step. She looked out across the forest and saw the pine trees wearing heavy coats of white, their branches bent low under the weight, some of them touching the ground. Several trees had fallen during the storm, their root systems torn from the frozen earth, leaving dark craters in the snow like wounds. But the cottage stood. The roof she had repaired held every nail, the walls she had chinked didn't leak, the door she had reinforced with crossbars hadn't budged. The chimney still drew true, sending a thin line of smoke straight up into the clearing sky like a signal to the world. We are here. We survived. We are still here. 40 years of emptiness, and the cottage had survived the worst storm in memory. Not because it was strong, because someone had cared enough to make it strong again. Margaret built it, Wren rebuilt it, and the cottage repaid them both by refusing to fall. Wren stood on the porch and breathed cold air and felt something settle inside her that had been restless for a very long time. Not victory, not pride, something quieter than that. The feeling of knowing you did the hardest thing you've ever done, and it was enough. Then she heard the sound, distant, muffled by snow, but unmistakable, the grinding grumble of an engine coming up the ridge, coming toward the cottage. Wren looked east, toward the gravel road, toward the place where Ray Colton's development trailer sat behind its orange survey stakes. The sound grew louder, closer, a vehicle pushing through deep snow with the slow, determined effort of someone who intended to arrive. She went inside, picked up the axe, checked that Micah was wrapped in blankets near the fire. Then she stood on the porch and waited for whatever was coming. The engine sound died somewhere below the ridge. Wren stood on the porch with the axe in both hands, her breath making small white clouds in the frozen air. The forest was silent again, except for the occasional soft thud of snow sliding from an overburdened branch. She could feel her heartbeat in her temples. Behind her, through the open door, she could hear Micah shifting on the cot, still weak from the fever, still wrapped in every blanket the cottage had. She waited. 1 minute, two, then the sound of footsteps in deep snow reached her slow, and labored someone climbing the ridge on foot because the vehicle couldn't make it the rest of the way. Wren tightened her grip on the axe and took one step forward on the porch. The figure that emerged from the tree line was not what she expected. Not Ray Colton, not a CPS worker in a government jacket, not a police officer or a lawyer or anyone Wren had spent the last 6 days imagining while the storm buried the world outside. It was a woman. She was old, maybe 65, maybe 70, the kind of age that's hard to read on people who have spent their lives outdoors. She was tall for a woman with silver hair pulled back under a wool cap, and she wore a heavy canvas coat over layers of flannel that made her look broader than she probably was. Her boots were caked with snow to the knee. She carried a canvas rucksack on one shoulder and a walking stick in her free hand, and she moved through the snow with the slow, deliberate patience of someone who had been walking through Montana winters her entire life. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, looked at the cottage, looked at the smoke rising from the chimney, looked at the firewood stacked against the walls, at the cleared garden rows, now buried under white, at the rain barrel beside the corner of the roof. Then she looked at Wren, at the axe, at the 16-year-old girl standing barefoot on a frozen porch, protecting a door that led to everything she had left in the world. The woman didn't raise her hands the way Ray had, didn't smile, didn't perform. She just stood there in the snow and looked at Wren with an expression that was impossible to fake because it wasn't trying to be anything. It was recognition. "You're a Dawson," the woman said, not a question, a statement, spoken with the flat certainty of someone who recognized something in Wren's face or in her posture or in the way she stood in front of a door with an axe and no intention of moving. Wren didn't lower the axe. "Who are you?" "My name is Nora Dawson," the woman said. "Margaret was my grandmother. And unless I'm very much mistaken, she was yours too." They stood on opposite sides of the clearing for a long time. Snow fell lightly between them, small flakes drifting straight down through the windless air. The forest was quiet. The cottage chimney smoked. And two women who shared a last name and a bloodline neither of them had known about stared at each other across 40 years of silence. Nora spoke first. She spoke carefully, the way people speak when they know the wrong word will close a door that might never open again. "I've been watching the smoke from this chimney for almost 3 weeks," she said. "I live in Pine Fall, about 4 miles south on the county road. I drive past the trailhead every morning on my way to work, and 3 weeks ago I saw smoke coming from a place that hasn't had smoke in 40 years. She paused, shifted the rucksack on her shoulder. "At first I thought it was squatters. We get them sometimes, especially in winter. People looking for shelter who don't care whose land they're on. I almost called the sheriff. But then I came up here one evening just to look and I saw the garden. She nodded toward the buried rose near the cottage. Squatters don't clear garden beds. Squatters don't stack firewood that neatly. Squatters don't repair roofs. Whoever was in this cottage was taking care of it, and that made me curious enough to wait before calling anyone. Wren's arms were starting to ache from holding the axe, but she didn't lower it. You came to the cottage at night, she said. You stood outside the window. Nora shook her head slowly. That wasn't me. I only came up here twice before today, both times in daylight, and I stayed at the tree line. I never came close enough to leave prints by the window. Something cold moved through Wren's chest. If the footprints weren't Nora's, then the only person who had been close enough to the cottage to look through the window at night was Ray. Nora seemed to read the change in Wren's face. She took one careful step forward. I think we need to talk, she said, and I think you already know why. Wren looked at the woman for a long moment, at her face lined and weathered and patient, at her eyes, which were brown like Wren's, like their father's, like the old photograph of Margaret standing beside this same cottage 50 years ago. She lowered the axe. Come inside, she said, but take your boots off at the door. Nora smiled for the first time. It wasn't a performance, it was the small, private smile of a person who had just heard something familiar in someone else's voice. She took her boots off at the door. Micah was sitting up on the cot when they came inside. His face was pale from the fever, his hair matted with sweat, but his eyes were clear and watchful. He looked at Nora with the careful assessment of a child who has recently learned that not all adults can be trusted. Who's she? He asked Wren. Not Nora, Wren. Because Wren was the authority in this room and everyone knew it. Her name is Nora, Wren said. She's family. Micah studied the old woman. What kind of family? The kind that shares a last name and a grandmother, Nora said. She crouched down slowly until she was at the boy's eye level. And the kind that brings soup. She opened her rucksack and pulled out a thermos. The cap came off and the smell that filled the cottage was so rich and warm and deeply, impossibly good that Micah's entire body leaned toward it before his mind caught up. Chicken soup, a real chicken soup with fat golden noodles and chunks of carrot and the thick savory warmth of something that had been simmered for hours by someone who knew what they were doing. Wren poured it into tin cups and handed one to Micah. The boy drank with both hands wrapped around the cup, his eyes closing, his whole body softening. Wren drank too, and the warmth spread through her chest and her stomach and her arms and her legs, and for one moment she felt something she hadn't felt in months, taken care of. Not in charge, not the protector, the provider, the wall between her brother and the dark. Just a tired girl drinking hot soup that someone else had made and letting that be enough for a few minutes. Nora sat on the floor beside the stove and waited until they were finished. Then she began talking. She told the story from the beginning. Margaret Dawson had been born Margaret Ellis in 1918 in the Flathead Valley. She married Thomas Dawson in 1948, and together they bought 40 acres of mountain forest north of Pine Fall with Thomas's army savings. They built the cottage by hand, just the two of them, cutting the logs from the land and hauling them to the clearing with a mule and a pulley system Thomas designed himself. It took them 2 summers. Margaret planted the first garden the week the roof went on. Thomas died in 1971 from a heart attack while splitting firewood near the porch. Margaret buried him beneath the big pine tree at the western edge of the clearing, the one with the trunk so wide 3 people couldn't circle it with their arms. She stayed in the cottage alone after that for almost 20 years, growing her own food, keeping her own counsel, turning away every logger, every developer, every county official who came up the ridge with an offer or a threat. Nora's voice changed when she talked about the offers. They started coming in the late 70s, she said. Developers from Kalispell and Missoula. They wanted the whole ridge for ski lodges and vacation homes. Margaret turned them all down. She didn't even let them pass the fence. One of them threatened to take the land through eminent domain, and Margaret wrote to the county commissioner and told him if anyone set foot on Dawson land without her permission, she would consider it trespassing and respond accordingly. Nora paused. They believed her. Margaret died in 1989. She was 71 years old. Nora was 29 at the time, living in Pine Fall, working at the county library. She had visited the cottage as a child but hadn't been back in years. When Margaret died, the property passed into a kind of legal limbo. There was no will, no clear heir had filed a claim. Nora had looked into it, but without the original deed, the county wouldn't recognize her claim. The deed, she said, looking at Wren. Margaret told me once that she hid it somewhere in the cottage. I came up here a few times after she died looking for it, but I never found it. Eventually, I stopped looking. I figured the land would just sit there forgotten until the trees grew over the cottage and erased it completely. Wren reached under the cot. She pulled out the tin box and set it on the floor between them, opened the lid, took out the property deed, the photograph, and Margaret's letter, and laid them side by side on the wooden planks. Nora stared at the documents for a long time without touching them. Then she picked up the photograph with both hands and held it close to her face, and Wren saw something happen to the old woman's expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It didn't crumble, it didn't break. It simply opened the way a closed door opens when someone on the other side finally turns the handle. I haven't seen her face in 30 years, Nora said quietly. They sat together in the warm cottage, 3 Dawson, in a room built by Dawsons, and Nora read Margaret's letter by the light of the stove. When she reached the last line, "Don't let them take it," she set the paper down and looked at Wren. "I know who them is," Wren said. "His name is Ray Colton." Nora's expression hardened. "I know exactly who Ray Colton is." The story Nora told about Ray Colton was the story of a slow, patient theft. He had arrived in the Pine Fall area 5 years ago, a developer from Billings with enough money to buy land and enough charm to convince people to sell it for less than it was worth. He started small, purchasing abandoned parcels from elderly landowners who didn't know what their property was worth or didn't have the energy to fight. He used friendly visits and small favors, bags of groceries, help with repairs, rides to doctor's appointments, building trust with isolated people who had no one else. Then once the trust was built, he would present the offer, always reasonable, always less than the land was worth, and always accompanied by a gentle reminder that the alternative property taxes, maintenance, the difficulty of aging alone in the mountains was worse. Over 5 years, Ray Colton had assembled nearly 800 acres of mountain ridge north of Pine Fall. He had permits for a luxury resort development that would bring jobs and tourists and tax revenue to the county. He had the support of half the county commissioners and the quiet opposition of the other half. He had everything he needed, except 40 acres. Margaret Dawson's 40 acres sat right in the center of his project map. Without them, the main lodge couldn't be built, the access road couldn't be routed. The whole development would have to be redesigned at enormous cost or abandoned entirely. For 5 years, Nora said, I've been the only person standing between Ray Colton and this land. I filed objections with the county. I wrote letters to the planning commission. I attended every public hearing and told them the Dawson family never authorized the sale. But they kept asking me for the deed. Where's your proof, they said. Show us the documents. She looked at the tin box on the floor. And I never could, until now. Wren felt the pieces falling into place, each one landing with the solid click of something that had always been true, just hidden. Ray's visits, his questions about papers and documents, his fake forestry ID, the footprints beneath the window placed there so he could verify what was inside before deciding how to proceed. And finally, the CPS threat, the one move guaranteed to remove 2 children from an unclaimed property and leave it open for the taking. He's already called them, Wren said. CPS. He told me he would, and he's not the kind of man who bluffs. Nora nodded slowly. I expected that. That's why I came today and not next week. I wanted to reach you before they did. She reached into her rucksack and pulled out a manila folder. I called a lawyer in Kalispell yesterday, a real one, not one of Colton's people. Her name is Beth Hargrove. She's handled property disputes in this county for 30 years and she doesn't particularly like developers. I told her the situation. She said if we can produce the original deed and establish a familial chain to the current occupants, we have a case. A strong one. She looked at Wren. Can you tell me your father's name? James Dawson, Wren said. And his father, Robert Dawson. Robert's father, Wren, hesitated. Then she remembered something her father had told her on one of those long ago evenings, sitting in the living room of the yellow house, telling stories about family and history and the people who came before. William Dawson, she said, Margaret, and Thomas's son. He left Montana in the 50s and moved to Missoula. That's where our side of the family started. Nora closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and smiled, and this time the smile was wide and full and carried 40 years of waiting in it. William was my father's brother, she said. Your great-grandfather and my grandfather were brothers. That makes us family Wren. Distant but real, and more importantly, it makes you a Dawson with a direct bloodline claim to this land. She tapped the manila folder. Beth Hargrove can file the paperwork within a week. Once the deed is registered and the familial chain established, Colton can touch this property. And as for CPS, I've already applied to be your temporary legal guardian. I filed the paperwork this morning before I drove up here. Wren stared at her. You did what? Nora shrugged. I'm 68 years old. I own a house in town. I have a clean record, a steady income, and a spare bedroom. The state of Montana will have a hard time arguing that 2 Dawson children are better off with strangers than with a Dawson who wants them. Micah had been listening from the cot. His soup cup was empty. His eyes moved between Wren and Nora with the careful attention of a child who has learned to read adult conversations the way all the children read picture books word by word, watching for the ones that matter. Does that mean we get to stay? He asked. Nora looked at him. It means I'm going to fight like hell to make sure you do. Micah thought about this. Then he nodded once, seriously, as if approving a strategy he had been weighing. Good, he said, because Wren fights too, and she doesn't lose. Wren looked at her brother and felt something crack open inside her chest. Something that had been sealed shut since the night they walked out of Garrett's door. It wasn't relief. Not yet. It was the first hairline fracture in the wall she had built around herself, the wall that held the fear and the loneliness and the terrible weight of carrying everything alone. Someone was standing on her side of the wall now, and for the first time in months she didn't have to hold it by herself. They came 3 days later. 2 vehicles climbed the ridge on Thursday morning. Wren heard them before she saw them, the crunch of tires on frozen ground, the whine of engines working through deep snow. She was standing near the woodpile when the first vehicle appeared at the edge of the clearing, Ray Colton's white Ford F250. Behind it, a dark green county SUV with a Montana state seal on the door. Ray got out first. He wore the same canvas jacket, the same heavy boots, but today he also wore a tie beneath the jacket visible at the collar, as if he wanted to look official without committing to it fully. A man in a gray overcoat climbed out of the passenger side. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with the uncomfortable stiffness of someone who had never walked on uneven ground and didn't appreciate starting now. Ray's lawyer. From the county SUV came a woman in her 40s, dressed in practical winter clothing with a county ID badge clipped to her jacket and a clipboard under her arm. She had short brown hair and a face that looked like it had seen a lot of difficult mornings but hadn't given up on the afternoons yet. The CPS caseworker. Nora was already on the porch. She had arrived at dawn as planned, bringing coffee in a thermos and the manila folder that was now considerably thicker than it had been 3 days ago. Beth Hargrove, the lawyer, had worked fast. The folder contained the original property deed, a notarized genealogical chart tracing the Dawson family line from Thomas and Margaret through William, Robert, James, and finally to Ren and Micah, a signed affidavit from Nora confirming the familial connection and a temporary guardianship petition filed with the county court. Ray stopped at the edge of the clearing. He saw Nora first, and something happened to his face. Not surprise. Something more controlled than surprise, the careful rearrangement of features that a man performs when the situation has changed and he hasn't decided yet how to respond. Nora, he said, didn't expect to see you up here. I imagine you didn't, Nora said. Ray recovered quickly. He turned to the CPS caseworker with a performance of concern so practiced it was almost seamless. This is the property I called about, he said. 2 minor children living without adult supervision, no running water, no electricity, no heat except a wood stove. I felt it was my responsibility to alert the county. The caseworker, whose name tag read D. Mercer, looked at the cottage, at the chimney smoke, at the stacked firewood, at Nora standing on the porch with her arms crossed. And you are, she said to Nora. Nora Dawson. I am the children's great aunt once removed, and I filed for temporary guardianship with the county court as of Monday morning. The paperwork is in process. Ray's lawyer stepped forward. He was a thin man with a thin voice and the particular brand of confidence that comes from billing by the hour. My client has been monitoring this property for several months. The land in question has no registered owner on file with the county assessor's office. These children appear to be occupying it without legal authority. Nora reached into the manila folder and produced a single sheet of paper. She held it out to the lawyer without looking at him. This is the original property deed for this parcel, she said, dated 1971. Transferring 40 acres to Thomas and Margaret Dawson, notarized and recorded with the county clerk at the time of sale. It was never transferred, never sold, and never abandoned. It passed by descent through the Dawson family line to these 2 children who are the direct great-great-grandchildren of the original owners. The lawyer took the paper, read it, held it up to the light as if checking for a watermark. Then he read it again. His expression didn't change, but his silence was louder than anything he could have said. Ray stepped forward. Now hold on. Nobody's seen this deed in 40 years. You can't just produce a document out of thin air and claim it proves ownership. Nora looked at him with the steady patience of a woman who had been waiting 5 years for this exact moment. I didn't produce it, she said. Margaret hid it in this cottage before she died. Her great-great-granddaughter found it. The chain of title is documented. The genealogical connection is notarized. And if you'd like to challenge it, Ray, I'm sure Beth Hargrove would be happy to see you in court. She tells me she's been looking forward to it. Ray's jaw tightened. For the first time since Wren had met him, the smile was completely gone. What remained underneath was not ugly exactly, but it was honest. The face of a man who had been outplayed and knew it but couldn't yet accept it. He turned to the caseworker. Regardless of who owns the land, these are 2 minors living alone in the wilderness. That's a child welfare issue, not a property issue. The caseworker, D. Mercer, had been watching the exchange with the quiet attention of someone who has learned to listen more than she speaks. Now she looked at Nora. Is there adult supervision in place? I'm here, Nora said. I have been visiting regularly, and as I said, the guardianship petition has been filed. I can provide housing in town, school, enrollment, medical care, everything the state requires. But I'd also like you to see the conditions these children have been living in before you make any determination. She stepped back from the door and gestured inside. Dee Mercer walked up the porch steps and entered the cottage. Wren followed her in, standing near the stove, watching the woman's eyes move across the room the way eyes move when they're looking for evidence. The cottage was clean, the stove was lit and warm, the shelves held jars of dried food, apples, walnuts, beans. The water bucket beside the stove was full of clear spring water. The blankets on the cot were folded, the floor was swept, the repaired window was sealed tight, the crossbar on the door was solid. It was not a palace, it was not a suburban home with central heating and a 2-car garage. but it was cared for. Every inch of it was cared for by a girl who had spent 2 months making it habitable with nothing but an axe, a journal, and the refusal to quit. Dee Mercer wrote on her clipboard. Then she crouched down beside the cot where Micah sat wrapped in the blanket, watching her with his careful, assessing eyes. "Hey there," she said. "What's your name, Micah? How old are you, Micah?" 7. Dee Mercer looked around the cottage again. Then she asked the question that would decide everything. "Do you feel safe here, Micah?" The boy looked at the caseworker. He looked at the stove, at the shelves, at the walls his sister had repaired, at the door she had reinforced, at the firewood she had stacked, at the food she had gathered, at the water she had carried, at every single thing in this room that existed, because a 16-year-old girl had decided that her brother would not be cold, would not be hungry, would not be alone, would not be taken from her, no matter what it cost. Then he looked at Wren. "My sister kept me warm all winter," he said. "She caught fish and picked apples and fixed the roof when it broke. She made me tea when I was sick, and she stayed up all night so I didn't have to be scared." He paused. His voice was quiet but steady, the voice of a child who has grown up faster than any child should. "I want to stay home," he said. "This is home. Wren made it home." The room was very still. The fire crackled in the stove. Snow dripped from the eaves outside. Dee Mercer looked at her keyboard for a long moment. Then she looked at Wren, and something passed between them that wasn't in any case file or procedure manual, a recognition from one woman to another that what had happened in this cottage was not neglect, it was the opposite of neglect. It was love expressed through labor, through sacrifice, through the daily decision to keep going when every reasonable measure said to stop. Dee Mercer stood up. She walked outside to the porch where Ray and his lawyer were waiting. Nora stood beside the door. "The children are in no immediate danger," Dee Mercer said. "The living conditions are basic but adequate. There is food, water, shelter, and heat. The older sibling has demonstrated a high level of care for the younger child." She looked at Nora. "I'll support the temporary guardianship petition pending a home inspection in town and school enrollment within 30 days. The children can remain here under Miss Dawson's supervision until the court hearing." She turned to Ray. "Mr. Colton, I appreciate you bringing this to our attention, but based on what I've seen today, this is not a removal case. This is a family matter, and it appears to be resolving itself." Ray's lawyer put a hand on his client's arm, the kind of hand that says, "Stop talking." Ray looked at the cottage one more time, at the smoke, at the firewood, at the girl standing in the doorway with her chin raised and her hands at her side, standing exactly where Margaret Dawson had stood 50 years ago, telling a man with money and plans that this land was not for sale. He turned and walked back to his truck without another word. The lawyer followed. The engine started. The white F250 backed down the ridge and disappeared into the trees. The county SUV followed a few minutes later, Dee Mercer nodding once to Nora before she drove away. And then the clearing was quiet again. Nora stayed for dinner. They cooked together, the three of them, using ingredients from Nora's rucksack and food from the cottage shelves. Nora brought potatoes and onions and a small packet of dried rosemary from her garden in town. Wren contributed rabbit meat from the morning snare and walnuts from the orchard. Micah's job was to stir the pot, which he did with enormous concentration, standing on a block of firewood beside the stove so he could reach. The cottage filled with a smell so warm and complete that it seemed to push the walls outward, making the room larger than it was, making the forest outside less vast, making the darkness less dark. They ate sitting on the floor beside the stove because there was only one chair and nobody wanted it. Nora told stories about Margaret, about how she used to sing while she gardened old hymns in a voice that carried through the trees, about how she made apple butter every fall and left jars of it on the fence post for anyone who walked past, even though nobody ever did. About how she once chased a black bear out of the orchard with a broom, and a string of language that would have made a sailor blush. Micah laughed. The sound filled the cottage like light filling a room when curtains are pulled open, sudden and bright and so necessary that you didn't realize how much you missed it until it was there. Ren listened and ate and felt the hairline fracture in her walls spread a little wider, not breaking, opening, the way ice opens in spring when the water beneath it starts to move again. After dinner, Nora put her coat on and stood near the door. "I'll be back in 2 days," she said, "with more food and warmer clothes for both of you. And Beth Hargrove wants to come up next week to take photographs of the deed and the cottage for the court filing." She looked at Wren. "You did something extraordinary here. You know that, right?" Wren shook her head. "I just did what had to be done." Nora smiled. "That's what Margaret used to say too." She pulled her wool cap on and opened the door. Cold air rushed in, clean and sharp and smelling of pine. The clearing was white under a sky full of stars, more stars than Wren had ever seen, as if the storm had scrubbed the atmosphere clean and left nothing between the earth and the universe but empty space and light. Nora walked to the edge of the clearing, then turned back. "One more thing. I found out something about your uncle, Garrett. He checked himself into a treatment program in Kalispell 2 weeks ago. Voluntarily. I don't know what that means for the future, but I thought you should know." Wren stood in the doorway and absorbed this. She felt nothing at first, just the information landing like a stone thrown into deep water, sinking to a place she would visit later when she was ready. Not forgiveness, not anger, just the quiet acknowledgement that somewhere out there a broken man was trying to put himself back together, and that was his journey, not hers. "Thank you," she said. Nora disappeared into the trees. The weeks that followed carried a different weight. Not easier, different. Nora came every 2 days, bringing supplies, bringing news, bringing the steady presence of an adult who didn't want anything from them except to help. She brought warm jackets and wool socks and a pair of boots for Micah that actually fit. She brought books for both of them, school books and novels, and a field guide to Montana wildlife that Micah carried everywhere like a talisman. Beth Hargrove came to the cottage on a Wednesday, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain and a handshake that could crack walnuts. She photographed every document, took statements from Wren and Nora, walked the property line with a GPS unit matching Margaret's deed to the actual terrain. When she finished, she stood on the porch and looked out at the forest and said something Wren would always remember. "In 30 years of practicing law, I have never once seen a case this clean. Margaret Dawson knew exactly what she was doing when she hid those documents. She was protecting them from the people she knew would come, and she was right." The court hearing happened in January at the county courthouse in Kalispell. Wren wore borrowed clothes that didn't quite fit and sat in a wooden chair beside Nora, while a judge reviewed the deed, the genealogical chart, the guardianship petition, and Dee Mercer's report. Ray Colton's lawyer filed an objection. The judge read it, set it aside, and asked one question. "Is there any evidence that this deed is fraudulent or that the chain of title is broken?" The lawyer admitted that there was not. The judge signed the guardianship order and the property registration in the same sitting. It took 12 minutes. 40 acres of Montana forest fought over for 50 years, defended by 3 generations of Dawson women, settled in 12 minutes with a signature and a stamp. Wren walked out of the courthouse into January sunlight and stood on the steps and felt the cold air on her face, and understood for the first time that the cottage was legally, permanently, irrevocably theirs. Nora put a hand on her shoulder. "Margaret would be proud of you." Wren didn't trust herself to speak, so she just nodded. Spring came slowly to the ridge, the way spring always comes to the mountains, not all at once but in pieces. First, the temperature climbed above freezing for a few hours each afternoon. Then the snow began to retreat from the south-facing slopes, pulling back like a tide, exposing dark earth and the first pale shoots of grass underneath. The creek ran faster, swollen with meltwater. The birds returned, filling the morning with sounds that had been absent for months. Wren stood in the garden on the first warm day of April and pushed a shovel into the soil. The earth was soft and dark and smelled of everything that had been sleeping beneath the snow, all winter roots and seeds, and the slow, patient chemistry of decay becoming life. She planted peas first, the way Margaret had, along the south fence where the sun hit longest. She used seeds Nora had bought from the hardware store in Pine Fall, small and wrinkled and ordinary looking, the kind of thing you could hold in your palm and not understand what it would become. Micah worked beside her. He was stronger now, his cheeks no longer hollow, his arms brown from the early spring sun. He dug holes with a small trowel and dropped seeds in with careful precision, counting under his breath, making sure each one was exactly the right depth, because Wren had shown him once and he remembered. Nora came on weekends. She brought starts for tomatoes and peppers and herbs grown in her kitchen window in town. She showed Wren how to build cold frames from old window glass and scrap lumber, extending the growing season by weeks. She brought Margaret's apple butter recipe written on a card in handwriting that Wren now recognized the way she recognized her own. The orchard bloomed in late April. Wren walked down the hill one morning and stopped at the edge of the clearing and stood completely still. The apple trees, every one of them, were covered in white blossoms. The entire hillside had turned into a cloud of white and pink, and the air was so thick with the smell of apple blossom that breathing felt like drinking something sweet. Thomas Dawson had planted these trees more than 50 years ago. Margaret had tended them for 20 years after his death. And now, after 4 decades of growing wild and untouched, they bloomed as if they had been waiting for someone to come back and see it. That evening, Wren built a fire in the stove and cooked dinner while Micah read aloud from the wildlife guide, identifying every bird they had heard that day, his voice filling the cottage the way warmth fills a room quietly and completely. Nora had helped them install a real glass window to replace the one Wren had boarded up. Light came through it now, golden in the late afternoon, falling across the floor in a rectangle that moved slowly toward the cot as the sun went down. The cottage was cleaner than it had been in 40 years. The shelves were stocked, the walls were solid, the roof was tight. It was still small, still one room, still a tiny forgotten place buried deep in a Montana forest where nobody came unless they meant to. But it was theirs. After dinner, Micah pulled on his jacket and his new boots and walked outside. Wren followed him. They sat together on the porch steps, the same steps where Wren had stood with an axe on the night they arrived 5 months and a lifetime ago. The sun was setting behind the western mountains. The sky was pink and gold and deep blue at the edges, the kind of sky that only exists in places where there are no lights for 50 miles in any direction. The pine trees stood tall and dark against it, and the air smelled of wood smoke and melting snow and apple blossoms drifting up from the orchard below. Micah sat close to her. He held a tin cup of warm water in both hands, the same way he had held it on their first morning in the cottage when he asked if they were staying. Now he asked a different question. "We're home now, right?" Wren looked at the garden, the cleared rows dark with new seeds, the soil turned and waiting. She looked at the chimney, the thin line of smoke rising straight up into the still evening air. She looked at the forest, the endless pines, the ridge, the mountains beyond. She looked at the porch Nora had helped her rebuild last week, the boards level and solid nailed down by 4 hands instead of 2. She looked at her brother, 7 years old, sitting beside her in the last light of the day, holding a cup of warm water, asking the only question that had ever really mattered. "Yeah, Micah," she said quietly, "we're home." The boy leaned against her shoulder. The sun dropped below the mountains. The first stars appeared above the pine trees, faint at first, then bright, then everywhere filling the sky from one horizon to the other. The cottage glowed behind them, warm and small and full of the kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that comes after a long, hard journey when you finally stop walking and look around and realize that the place you've been searching for was waiting for you all along. Sometimes the places the world forgets are the ones waiting for the people the world forgot too. And sometimes a girl with an axe and a broken window and a brother who trusted her is enough to bring a forgotten place back to life. Ren Dawson sat on the porch of the Pine Fall cottage and watched the stars come out over Montana, and she didn't move for a very long time. There was nowhere else to go, there was nowhere else she wanted to be. The forest held its breath, the chimney smoked, and somewhere deep in the roots of an old walnut tree, the deed to 40 acres of Dawson land rested in its oilcloth wrapping, patient and permanent the way love is patient, the way land is permanent, the way some things once planted never stop growing.